James Monroe was the fifth President of the United States. Monroe was the last president who was a founding father of the United States and the last president from the Virginian dynasty in the Republican generation. Born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Monroe was of the planter class and fought in the American Revolutionary War. He was wounded in the Battle of Trenton with a musket ball to his shoulder. After studying law under Thomas Jefferson from 1780 to 1783, he served as a delegate in the Continental Congress. As an anti-federalist delegate to the Virginia Convention that considered ratification of the United States Constitution, Monroe opposed ratification, claiming it gave too much power to the central government. He took an active part in the new government, and in 1790 he was elected to the Senate of the First United States Congress, where he joined the Jeffersonians. He gained experience as an executive as the governor of Virginia and rose to national prominence as a diplomat in France, when he helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. During the War of 1812, Monroe held the critical roles of Secretary of State and the Secretary of War under President James Madison. Facing little opposition from the fractured Federalist Party, Monroe was easily elected president in 1816, winning over 80% of the electoral vote and becoming the last president during the first party system era of American politics. With the ratification of the Treaty of 1818, under the successful diplomacy of his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the United States extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific, giving America harbor and fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest. The United States and Britain jointly occupied the Oregon Country. In addition to the acquisition of Florida, the landmark Treaty of 1819 secured the border of the United States along the 42nd parallel to the Pacific Ocean and represented America's first determined attempt at creating an American global empire. As nationalism surged, partisan fury subsided and the era of good feelings ensued until the Panic of 1819 struck and dispute over the admission of Missouri embroiled the country in 1820. Nonetheless, Monroe won near unanimous re-election. Monroe supported the founding of colonies in Africa for free African Americans that would eventually form the nation of Liberia, whose capital, Monrovia, is named in his honor. In 1823, he announced the United States' opposition to any European intervention in the recently independent countries of the Americas with the Monroe Doctrine, which became a landmark in American foreign policy. His presidency concluded the first period of American presidential history before the beginning of Jacksonian democracy and the second-party system era. Following his retirement in 1825, Monroe was plagued by financial difficulties. He died in New York City on July 4, 1831. Early life. James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758, in his parents' house located in a wooded area of Westmoreland County, Virginia. The site is marked and is 1 mile from the unincorporated community known today as Monroe Hall, Virginia. The James Monroe family home site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1979. His father, Spence Monroe, was a moderately prosperous planter who also practiced carpentry. His mother, Elizabeth Jones, married Spence Monroe in 1752 and they had several children. His paternal great-grandfather, Patrick Andrew Monroe, emigrated to America from Scotland in the mid-17th century. In 1650, he patented a large tract of land in Washington Parish, Westmoreland County, Virginia. Among James Monroe's ancestors were French Huguenot immigrants, who came to Virginia in 1700. Education first tutored at home by his mother Elizabeth. Between the ages of 11 and 16, the young Monroe studied at Campbelltown Academy, a school run by Reverend Archibald Campbell of Washington Parish. There he excelled as a pupil, and progressed through Latin and mathematics faster than most boys his age. John Marshall, later Chief Justice of the United States, was among his classmates. Upon the death of his father in 1774, Monroe inherited his small plantation and slaves, officially joining the ruling class of the planter elite in what had become the Slave Society of Virginia. 16 years old, he began forming a close relationship with his maternal uncle, the influential Judge Joseph Jones, who had been educated at the Inns of Court in London and was the executor of his father's estate. That same year, Monroe enrolled in the College of William and Mary. At the time, most students were charged with excitement over the prospect of rebellion against King George III, military service in the Revolutionary War and serious wounding in early 1776. About a year and a half after his enrollment, Monroe dropped out of college and joined the 3rd Virginia Regiment in the Continental Army, where his background as a college student and the son of a well-known planter enabled him to obtain an officer's commission. He never returned to earn a degree. In June 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Monroe and some other William and Mary students joined 24 older men in raiding the arsenal at the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg. They used the loot of 200 muskets and 300 swords to arm the Williamsburg militia. Although Andrew Jackson served as a courier in a militia unit at age 13, Monroe is regarded as the last U.S. president who was a Revolutionary War veteran, since he served as an officer of the Continental Army and took part in combat with the rest of Washington's army. Monroe's regiment was chased off Long Island in the fall of 1776 and down the length of New Jersey, crossing the Delaware River in December 1776. Down to mere days before their enlistments expired, the Army's commander, General Washington, decided that only a bold step could save the Army and the Revolutionary cause from oblivion. Washington ordered his force, that had shrunk 90% since the Battle of Brooklyn, which is also known by the wider name of Battle of Long Island, and down to under 3,000 effective soldiers, to cross the Delaware River on Christmas Day 1776 in the Battle of Trenton. Monroe and his regiment crossed over and marched through a nor'easter snowstorm north and then east towards Trenton. Along the way, the soldiers were spotted by a young patriot doctor, John Raeky, whose dogs had been awakened in the pre-dawn early morning. Raeky volunteered to lend his medical bag to the effort, saying that as many doctors as possible would be needed, fearing severe casualties from a clash with the battle-tested German-speaking Hessian professional mercenary soldiers. Avoiding detection, the Americans approached the center of Trenton from north and south. When the Hessians sounded the alarm, they tried to get several of their artillery pieces in action to pour grape shot into the Americans marching down towards the homes they had commandeered. Knowing that this would slow the assault, after a volley of artillery fire, Lieutenant Monroe and General Washington's cousin, Captain William Washington, and the men rushed to seize the guns before they could fire. Both young officers were severely wounded. Captain Washington was badly wounded in both hands, and young Lieutenant James Monroe was carried from the field bleeding badly after he was struck in the left shoulder by a musket ball, which severed an artery. It would be the young volunteer doctor, John Raeky, who clamped the artery, keeping him from bleeding to death and saving the life of a man who would go on to achieve so much in politics, both as a Virginian and on the national stage as a future president. The wounded soldier, Monroe, was sent home to Virginia to nurse his injuries. The Battle of Trenton would be Monroe's only battle, as he would spend the next 3 months recuperating from his wound. In John Trumbull's painting Capture of the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton, Monroe can be seen lying wounded at left center of the painting. In the famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, Monroe is depicted holding the American flag. After recuperating from his wound, he was appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, and tasked to recruit and lead a regiment. But the regiment was never raised. He returned to Williamsburg in September of 1779 and studied law with George Wythe, and then moved to Richmond to study law with Thomas Jefferson. In 1780 the British invaded Richmond, and as governor, Jefferson commissioned Monroe as a colonel to command the militia raised in response and act as liaison to the Continental Army in North Carolina. Monroe resumed studying law under Jefferson, and continued until 1783. Monroe was not particularly interested in legal theory or practice, but chose to take it up because he thought that it offered the most immediate rewards, and could ease his path to wealth, social standing, and political influence. After passing the bar, he practiced law in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Marriage and family. James Monroe married Elizabeth Cortright, daughter of Lawrence Cortright and Hannah Aspinwall Cortright, on February 16, 1786, in New York City. He had met her while serving with the Continental Congress, which then met in New York, the temporary capital of the new nation. After a brief honeymoon on Long Island, New York, the Monroes returned to New York City to live with her father until Congress adjourned. The Monroes had the following children: Eliza Cortright Monroe Hay. Eliza was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1786. And was educated in Paris at the school of Madame Campan during the time her father was the United States ambassador to France. In 1808 she married George Hay, a prominent Virginia attorney who had served as prosecutor in the trial of Aaron Burr and later U.S. District Judge. Their daughter, Hortense, was named in honor of her childhood friend, Hortense de Beauharnais, stepdaughter of Napoleon. Eliza alienated most of Washington society for her refusal to call on wives of the diplomatic corps, as was the custom, and caused another social furore in closing her sister's wedding to all but family and friends. For all her apparent vanity, however, she demonstrated genuine compassion during the fever epidemic that swept Washington during her father's presidency. She spent many sleepless nights selflessly caring for victims. Following the deaths of her husband and father, Eliza moved to Paris, France, where she died on January 27, 1840. James Spence Monroe. His grave reads, J.S. Monroe, so the proper names are speculative but typical of naming patterns of the time, which passed on family names. Maria Hester Monroe married her cousin Samuel L. Governor on March 8, 1820, in the first wedding of a president's child in the White House. Plantations and slavery. Monroe sold his small inherited Virginia plantation in 1783 to enter law and politics. Monroe later fulfilled his youthful dream of becoming the owner of a large plantation and wielding great political power. But his plantation was never profitable. Although he owned much more land and slaves and speculated in property, he was rarely on site to oversee the operations. Overseers treated the slaves harshly to force production, but the plantations barely broke even. Monroe incurred debts by his lavish and expensive lifestyle and often sold property to pay them off. Monroe was a wealthy Loudoun County plantation owner who owned numerous slave plantations including Oak Hill in Aldie. Monroe was an absentee slaveholder in that he had his overseers run the plantations while he lived elsewhere. Overseers moved or separated slave families from different Monroe plantations in accordance with production and maintenance needs of each satellite plantation. One of Monroe's slaves, named Daniel, often ran away from Monroe's plantation in Albemarle County to visit other slaves or separated family members. Monroe commonly referred to Daniel as a scoundrel, and described the worthlessness of Daniel as a runaway slave. Monroe's practice of moving and separating slave families was common treatment of slaves in the South. Early political career. Virginia politics. Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1782. He was elected to Congress in November 1783 and served in Annapolis until Congress left for Trenton in June 1784. He had served a total of 3 years when he finally retired from that office by the rule of rotation. By that time, the government was meeting in the temporary capital of New York City, in Virginia. The struggle in 1788 over the ratification of the proposed Constitution involved more than a simple clash between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Virginians held a full spectrum of opinions about the merits of the proposed change in national government. George Washington and James Madison were leading supporters. Patrick Henry and George Mason were leading opponents. Those who held the middle ground in the ideological struggle became the central figures, led by Monroe and Edmund Pendleton. These Federalists, who were for amendments, criticized the absence of a Bill of Rights and worried about surrendering taxation powers to the central government. Virginia ratified the Constitution in June 1788, largely because Monroe, Pendleton and followers suspended their reservations and vowed to press for changes after the new government had been established. Virginia narrowly ratified the Constitution. Monroe ran for a House seat in the first Congress but was defeated by Madison. In 1790 he was elected by the Virginia legislature as United States Senator. He soon joined the Democratic-Republican faction led by Jefferson and Madison, and by 1791 was the party leader in the Senate. Ambassador to France, Monroe resigned his Senate seat after being appointed minister to France in 1794. As ambassador, Monroe secured the release of Thomas Paine in revolutionary France after his arrest for opposition to the execution of Louis XVI. The government insisted that Paine be deported to the United States. Monroe arranged to free all the Americans held in French prisons. He also gained the freedom of Adrienne de Lafayette and issued her and her family American passports. She used that for travel to her husband, imprisoned in Olmutz. A strong friend of the French Revolution, Monroe tried to assure France that George Washington's policy of strict neutrality did not favor Britain. But American policy had come to favor Britain, and Monroe was stunned by the United States' signing of the Jay Treaty in London. With France and Britain at war, the Jay Treaty alarmed and angered the French. Washington had differences with Monroe and discharged him as minister to France, claiming his inefficiency, disruptive maneuvers, and failure to safeguard the interests of his country. Monroe had long been concerned about foreign influence on the presidency. He was alarmed by the Spanish diplomat Don Diego de Gardoqui, who in 1785 tried to convince Congress to allow Spain to close the Mississippi River to American traffic for 30 years. Spain controlled much of the Mississippi since taking over former French territory, including the important port of New Orleans. Monroe thought that Spain could have endangered the U.S. retention of its southwest and caused the dominance of the northeast. Monroe believed in both the strong presidency and the system of checks and balances. In the 1790s he fretted over an aging George Washington being too much influenced by close advisers such as Alexander Hamilton, whom Monroe thought too close to Britain. He was humiliated by Washington's criticism for his support of revolutionary France as minister to the nation, governor of Virginia and diplomat. Out of office, Monroe returned to practicing law in Virginia until elected governor there as a Democratic Republican, his first term serving from 1799 to 1802. He was re-elected Virginia's governor in 1811. He called out the state militia to suppress Gabriel's rebellion. Gabriel and 26 other enslaved people who participated were all hanged for treason. Monroe thought that foreign and Federalist elements had created the quasi-war of 1798 to 1800 and were behind efforts to prevent the election of Thomas Jefferson as president in 1800. As governor, he considered using the Virginia militia to force the outcome in favor of Jefferson. Federalists were likewise suspicious of Monroe, some seeing him as at best a French dupe and at worst a traitor. President Jefferson sent Monroe to France to assist Robert R. Livingston in negotiating the Louisiana Purchase. Monroe was then appointed minister to the court of St. James's in London from 1803 to 1807. In 1806 he negotiated a treaty with Great Britain, known as the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty. It would have extended the Jay Treaty of 1794, which had expired after 10 years. Jefferson had fought the Jay Treaty intensely in 1794–95 because he felt it would allow the British to subvert American republicanism. The treaty had produced 10 years of peace and highly lucrative trade for American merchants, but Jefferson was still hostile. When Monroe and the British signed a renewal in December 1806, Jefferson decided not to even submit it to the Senate for ratification. Although the new treaty called for 10 more years of trade between the United States and the British Empire and gave American merchants guarantees that would have been good for business, Jefferson refused to give up the potential weapon of commercial warfare against Britain and was unhappy that it did not end the hated British practice of impressment of American sailors. Jefferson did not attempt to obtain another treaty, and as a result, the two nations drifted from peace toward the War of 1812. After the failure of the treaty, Monroe returned to the United States in 1807. Monroe was deeply hurt by the administration's repudiation of the treaty, and Monroe fell out with Secretary of State James Madison. 1808 election and the Quids. The Democratic-Republican Party was increasingly factionalized, with old Republicans, or Quids, denouncing the Jefferson administration for abandoning true Republican principles. The Quids, seeing that Monroe's foreign policy had been rejected by Jefferson, tried to enlist Monroe in their cause. The plan was to run Monroe for president in the 1808 election in cooperation with the Federalist Party, which had a strong base in New England. John Randolph of Roanoke led the Quid effort to stop Jefferson's choice of James Madison. However, the regular Democratic Republicans overcame the Quids in the nominating caucus, kept control of the party in Virginia, and protected Madison's base. Monroe was not a candidate for president, and Madison was elected. After the election, Monroe quickly reconciled with Jefferson, but did not speak with Madison, a former friend, until 1810.